Right, hello everyone, and welcome to this last part of this session, fundamentally about urbanisation, different views on urbanisation and how it is going to play out in the future, especially in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has obviously, genuinely is an unprecedented event. Over my career, I've heard lots of people talk about this was unprecedented, but this actually was unprecedented. So first thing I would ask is whether people have got questions. There are some questions in the Q&A panel, which I'm just going to open up. So yeah, I've got the panel question open. So if people want to ask questions, please go right ahead. That's the first thing. And if they pop up there, I will answer them. Our panelists who have who recorded the video, Sabina, Arsha, and Nagumo San, had a very interesting conversation. It was quite wide-ranging, and one of the questions was, how do we think COVID-19 will affect cities? I mean, the questions about urbanization. Urbanization's obviously about cities, it's about buildings. There's a lot of conversation from a real estate point of view, and a city is made up of buildings and infrastructure in the most simplified way of putting it. I think something I would say is that talking about a book by Edward Glazier, a Harvard economist, cities are our greatest invention. So the state of the world as we know it, the state of the technological developments that we enjoy and which also challenge us, are part of this trend of industrialization, which in turn led to urbanization. Those two trends or processes can't easily be separated, but they resulted in developments in technology. And those technology developments could be digital. Technology for me doesn't just mean digital technology. So those technology developments resulted in rising living standards for people around the world, actually. And as a result of living in cities and these technology developments, which result in increased productivity, that leads to rises in economic growth, so increased per capita GDP. That leads to rising living standards. And one of the conclusions, which from the panel was about well-being being the focus, and rising living standards, which come from economic growth, is a long-term trend. And our improvements in well-being actually, in the wider sense, not the sense the panelists were talking about, which I will come to, but improvements in well-being are something we've all enjoyed actually since the start of the first industrial revolution. There's a theory that we're now in the fourth industrial revolution. And per capita GDP is a really good proxy for well-being, actually. I just want to say that because having high per capita GDP means we can enjoy high standards of education, high standards of healthcare, probably increased consumption of leisure. So there is a broad trend from industrialization for increased well-being, improvements in our standard of living. Is not universal. Of course, that's one of the problems. It's not evenly spread, and there are still people who don't have enough to eat or don't have access to these opportunities I'm talking about. And that's one of the challenges. Now, I've got a question here. What is your opinion on the timing to invest in, and that's a mega city? Do you still think it's profitable post-COVID? I mean, mega, I need to just clarify if that is mega cities or if it's a city I'm not, Megan city. So, I mean, investments in cities are investment actions of a whole series of smaller investors who together are investing in the city. So generally, apart from large infrastructure projects, there's no obvious focus for investment in cities. People who are investors and who have a diversified portfolio of assets will undoubtedly, I think, keep real estate in their asset portfolio. Infrastructure in recent years has been seen as a new asset class. So there are private investors investing in infrastructure. So infrastructure is quite a complex thing. It's what makes it the glue, if you like, that makes a city work. And infrastructure investments, we look at, you can have public infrastructure, which is publicly accessible but privately owned. The internet's probably the best ubiquitous example of that. There's very little internet infrastructure that's in the public sector. So private capital owns the infrastructure, but the public accessibility is a key to what makes it infrastructure. So I don't think that the COVID-19 is going to broadly discourage investment in cities. What could happen and what's likely to happen, and the panelists, when I was watching the video, I want to say, oh, what about this? There's one question I wanted to ask them, because if COVID-19 is having an impact on the way we occupy space in our city, and if, for example, there's a reduction in demand, then the consequence of that is that rents will fall. And if rents fall, if you think of the model of an occupational market and an investment market, falling rents will result in falling capital values. I think we've already seen this in some cases, and there could be I personally don't think I don't think cities are going to fall into disuse. I don't think I don't agree with the idea there's going to be mass migration from cities, even though there has been some choices for the lucky few to relocate from the city during the pandemic. That is not a case for me of migration from the city. And they're people who maybe had two homes in the first place, have got choices about where they locate, but many people in this world don't have a choice about where they live and where they work. And they are stuck in the city. I don't think that's a bad thing, but they're not, I just don't think we're going to see shrinkage of cities on a global scale. It's always been the case. We see some cities shrinking and some cities rising. So, the classical example is probably Detroit, which saw real shrinkage 10, 20 years ago and is now making a comeback. Liverpool in the UK is often cited as an example of a shrinking city. And over the years, over the centuries, we've seen some cities rise and others fall and not make, I often visit places, this used to be the biggest port in England, and there's no sign of a port anywhere. So changing spatial processes which prioritize some cities and mean other cities lose out, that will happen. I think the COVID pandemic could have accelerated it, but I don't think we're going to see real personally, I don't think we're going to see widespread shrinkage. We may see a realignment of values. We may. Right, I'm going to look at some of these questions. So I think it's okay I don't think we see a change in investment in cities, but it may be cheaper to invest in cities if prices change. Essential element of wellbeing in cities to access to green space. How might real estate markets support the creation of open green space? So one of the trends that's been going on for a long time is there's more open space in cities, but it's privately owned. So it's back to that point I made about private capital and public access, but it's privately owned, but it's not a right for the public to access it. I think it's a really good point about access to green space. And, if you look at cities that a lot of people would say are successful, like London, maybe Manhattan, there's a lot of public open space in those cities. And that maybe contributes to the successfulness of the city and the desirability for people to live in that city. I think the problem with the real estate market, I think private markets, talk about infrastructure again for a moment, private markets don't, infrastructure is a case of market failure. The private market won't deliver enough infrastructure. So the quantity of infrastructure delivered by the private market is probably lower than the quantity needed. That's why governments intervene. That's why infrastructure is often developed with private-public partnerships. Well, green space is in the same category, really, unless there are regulations in the planning ordinances, Section 106 kind of planning gain, where if you develop this, you'd better give us this green space here. I don't think the market, left to its own devices and without intervention, will necessarily deliver enough green space. And then I'm going to go to a question from Michael, two Michaels here, Michael Batelka. I mean, I'm going to slightly repeat what I said, but I think the rural to urban migration is a trend that's not going to change. City is an extremely efficient organizational device, invention. If you look at a place like Manhattan, I always say to my students, can you think of a place that's, people don't think of Manhattan as being sustainable, actually. And I'm not talking about COVID impacts. Manhattan is an example of a very dense development that's extremely efficient and sustainable. It's got neighborhoods, so we haven't got this center which is dead at night with suburbs. If you look at Atlanta, it's the absolute opposite. If you compare Atlanta, for example, to Barcelona, Barcelona is a nucleated small city, the same population as Atlanta, but Atlanta's, I think, 400 times bigger. It's an urban area, so it's very low density and quite probably unsustainable in that respect. Yeah, I'm going to say we don't know. So if I could see the future, I probably wouldn't be sitting talking to you now. But my assessment of the future is that cities will not be decimated in terms of their viability and their populations by COVID-19. I think we've still probably got 2 or 3 years before we know what the trends are. And then there's a question about second tier cities. I'm sort of conscious that I've only got a few minutes. Second tier cities are one of the most important groups of cities. So one thing I always say is I'm not really bothered about world cities, not bothered about mega cities, the Sydneys, San Francisco, London, Paris. Those cities are going to be okay. They are resilient in their nature. They've got access to resources, so their tax base allows them to develop in a way that second tier cities aren't. Most cities in the world are second tier cities, and that's where the problems come. They may not be resilient. They may not have access to the kind of systems like the central control room. You've probably all seen the picture of the Rio de Janeiro central control room. Small cities can't afford that kind of infrastructure, which makes them smart and which makes them resilient. So I think the big challenge and the unconsidered area in many cases is second tier cities. But the fact is that for most people, I'm not talking about a small global elite who can locate wherever they want. I think Sabina was talking about her staff can move and they can go to Nashville and so on, which I'm sure that's true. If you're working for CBRE, you're in a small global elite, maybe not the super wealthy, it's another level of elite. But you know, I guess if I was interested, I could relocate probably anywhere in the world if I put my mind to it. I'm lucky. But for most people, that's not an option. They are where they are and they want to be where they are and they're staying where they are. Will the pandemic change priorities of how cities are planned? I mean, I think there will. I think the pandemic, I don't want you to think I don't think the pandemic will have any effect. I think there's a lot of changes which will flow from the experience of the pandemic, and a lot of changes that city planners will try and implement to make their city more attractive. Because cities are, Michael Porter famously has written about the competitive advantage of nations, but he's also written an article about the competitive advantage of cities. And cities are competing with each other in various ways, regionally and globally. So city planners do want to make their city as attractive as possible in various ways, just because they want the people who are living there to have the best outcomes, but also because they want the people who they can attract there to look at the city and say, oh, this is a good place to come and live. Yeah, I mean, I noticed the panelists focused mostly on offices, and I thought, not absolutely sure if I've got time, so I'm going to wait. When anyone intervenes to stop me, I'll stop, but I'll carry on until then, Catherine. So I think retail, there was a lot of talk about offices, and the question about patterns of work and how we're going to work in the future is a big one, and how that impacts demand for office space. And the panelists talked also about the arrangement of office space and the ability, I think Arsha talked about how space could successfully be reconfigured and some can't. But what about retail? I mean, there's residential, there's housing, which is a big area, but retail is an area which has been under attrition for many years. Digital transformation, the rise of Amazon, changes in shopping habits have been really accelerated with the pandemic. I think there will be changes in the way we see our retail space being occupied. I don't expect there to be a death of shops, but a real change. Even now, the high street is made up of different shops than you'd have seen 20 years ago. And change is a constant process. 20 years earlier, you'd have seen different shops to those that you've seen, 20 years ago. So it is a matter of constant change. A city is a system which is changing all the time. If you read some of the work of Jane Jacobs, that's quite clear, and it should be changing. But I think retail's going to suffer more and more quickly. We're going to see higher vacancy rates in retail, which can only lead to lower rents and falls in value for investors. Two questions. How do we justify the low yield to investors? Why? I mean, my question is, how can you justify? I mean, you're not making value if you're, you know, an agent, for example, or a broker or an investment advisor. How do I justify that Bitcoin fell by X% in the last 2 weeks? There's a sort of notion that property prices only go up. All of us have been in the business for long enough know that is not the case. What we do know that if you hold property in the long term, it will have a, you know, over the economic cycle, several economic cycles, it will rise. But prices have always had points in time when they've fallen. The most obvious recent one in recent memory is the global financial crisis. So I'm not being glib when I say how do you justify it, but that's how investments work. You're not responsible for that change in value, so you don't need, for me, you don't need to justify it. So yeah, I think megacities are Marmite. There's quite a lot of, I love megacities and I don't like megacities. What I think about megacities is they're not the representative group of cities, even though they're the one that attracts the most interest and the most comment. I think the manufacturing question does depend on where you are. So in places like the UK and perhaps the US, perhaps the whole Donald Trump thing was about a sort of deindustrialization. I mean, Daniel Bell, famous sociologist from Harvard, wrote in the 60s about the you know, post-industrial age. He was very prescient because we moved to this idea of knowledge workers. And I mean, one impact, I think, on urbanization, which goes beyond COVID-19, is the impact of digital transformation, especially artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a bigger threat to jobs and to the processes of urbanization than COVID-19. COVID-19 is a shock to the system. Artificial intelligence is a progressive change that we are all going to have to cope with, including knowledge workers. So knowledge workers have been isolated from developments in mechanization and robotics, but that is changing. And the big law firms, the big surveying firms are wondering how artificial intelligence is going to affect their services and their workforce. Okay, Catherine, I'm just checking on time really before I carry on. Saffron's here. Hello, Saffron. Panel discuss the 15-minute city. Right, so the 15-minute city, let's talk about that for a moment. I mean, these trends can be quite voguish. They're quite driven by fashion. So, I mean, I think the 15-minute city, is there anything new in the concept of the 15-minute city? What do we mean by it? In a place like Paris or Manhattan, which I've mentioned, where there are neighborhoods, I could live in a neighborhood in Manhattan and have access to the things I need within 15 minutes walk. The same applies maybe definitely in Paris, where that city is made up of neighborhoods where people can live and work without going to the city center. So I'm not convinced by that concept. I think it's just a bit voguish. I've seen it talked about in many cities where they're interested in it, like Dubai. It's got a big interest in the 15-minute city. And they've tried to develop different sort of neighborhood centers, although that's a very unusual city, a very non-walkable city, actually. Lewis says that because of COVID, we're for sale. Not sure. Now, I think I've picked out most of the questions. Some of them I've answered. Two questions, two people's answers in one answer. What are my thoughts on the impact of on the role of impact investing and the urgent need for sustainability on the revival of cities? Yeah, I focused on your second question there, which was how do we justify the lower yield to investors? So, I mean, impact investing is on the rise, and SRI, sustainable, responsible, and impact investing is one trend where, if you look at the figures over the last 5 years, has really jumped up. Principles for responsible investment from the UN is part of that. And basically, there's an increased desire for investors to look at ESG factors, environmental, social, and governance factors, which are increasingly important when they make their investments. If you look in the UK at the bumpy ride that Deliveroo had when they went for an IPO, some investors opted out. Some investors said, this company doesn't meet our ESG requirements, especially on the governance side, possibly on the social side with the way they've got gig economy workers. And some big investors opted out. So that shows that principles for responsible investment are being followed quite rigorously by investors at the cost of an investment opportunity. So there may have been money to be made if that IPO had been successful. But the investors are saying, well, we're not just pursuing profit, but also sticking to principles of sustainable, responsible, and impact investing. The impact piece I haven't really answered. Impact is where we've got shareholder activism, or you're really getting involved in it. Landlords have always been impact investors. The property investors who own a property, actually from the first days of property investment, have been impact investors. They haven't defined themselves like that, but they are people who are looking at an individual asset and seeing how to change it or manage it or adapt it or let it to give the maximum returns, but also impacting on the environment. So if there are regulations to be complied with, tenants expect a building to be sustainable, then they, the landlord may have to make changes to make it sustainable. Answer to Saffron's question is yes. Have I read Automation and the Future of Work? I think that there's a lot of books on this, they're definitely worth considering if you're bothered about these things. Another good book here by Daniel Susskind from Oxford called A World Without Work. So the future, one of the bigger trends and the more important long-term trends than COVID, which is a big problem, I'm not minimizing it, is the question of the impact of digital technologies, particularly, of course, artificial intelligence. But the Side Business School and Andrew Baum have obviously got a long-standing initiative on PropTech, starting with PropTech 3.0 2 or 3 years ago, and a recent report from March last year, PropTech 2020. It's not specifically about artificial intelligence, but the changes that technology are bringing to real estate are wide-ranging and shouldn't be ignored. Now, Catherine, I can carry on. I don't know if I'm missing.
Nigel, I think it's probably about time for us to wrap up this session, but that has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your thoughtful responses to all these questions, and thank you to the audience as well for such probing questions. Really, really interesting discussion. Okay, I'm going to just make one public, sort of private request publicly. Saffron, do get in touch with me. We've lost touch over the last few years, but my email address. It'd be great to catch up. Okay, thank you very much. So I'll leave the meeting, Catherine, is that right? That's perfect. Thank you, Nigel, and thank you everyone who tuned in to listen. Thanks. Bye.